That's a better sense.
Hello, everybody here seems to have been here before, so the need for an introduction is relatively limited, but for those who haven't been here before, this is the 11th in the Jewish Historical Society's series of Fireside Chats, and we think our last one for the summer. We'll start again, we hope, in the autumn. Tonight, Sharon will be talking to Bob Green, who needs very little introduction to most of you, so I won't make an introduction in Bob's case. We do remind you of the work of the Jewish Historical Society, and in particular the books that you'll see outside. We encourage you to pick up a book on your way out and pay for it as well. That would be nice. And if any of you have any interest in the cemetery, we have an ongoing project documenting and cataloguing the cemetery, which is just about finished now, and we hope to be able to make all that available to you very soon, after long work by many dedicated people. Tonight Sharon will be talking to Bob Green. We hope to finish the main part of Bob's history in about 50 minutes or so, leaving 10 minutes for questions, all going well. If not, then Sharon will certainly tell us. Evening to Sharon and Bob Green.
Bob, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. As many of you who do know Bob, and those of you who don't, let me tell you, Bob is a remarkably modest man who has assured me during several times on our prep for this evening that he really has nothing to say about himself, but wants to talk about something that very important happened in Hong Kong and had an important impact for us all in Hong Kong. But ladies and gentlemen, as I think you will hear, Bob certainly has a very interesting story, a very rich story of his own to share this evening, and I'm delighted that you've been able to make time to share that with us tonight. Bob, you first came to Hong Kong over 40 years ago, that's right?
Almost 40, 1969.
And at that stage, you were a journalist living in the States?
I came here, I had taken a job, I was in Taiwan at the time working for Time-Life and New York Times, and an opportunity came to take up a job with NBC News here in Hong Kong, which I immediately accepted, and then continued to work for NBC from 69 until about 78.
You were acting as a stringer in those days?
Stringer in Taiwan, and here I was hired, I think the official title was Bureau Manager, but the real objective was to do reporting, which I was allowed to do, so I handled all of the radio news that was coming out. It was basically a job as a China watcher. America did not have relations with China at the time. This is right at the end of the Cultural Revolution. When I first arrived here, our crews were coming back with bullet holes in the jeeps. The riots were just ending here in Hong Kong. And for those next few years, without access directly to China, the reporting consisted of monitoring Chinese television and radio. We did a very interesting operation at the time. We used to go up to the top of Taimo Shan with a van and a camera inside and an antenna, which had been collapsed, and we took it out of the van and constructed it, and then turned the antenna toward China, and we filmed Chinese television. Kinescope is the proper word, actually. And used that. That was one of our very few sources of information about what was happening in China at the time. Of course, after a few years later, President Nixon went and opened it up. But so a lot of this was just secondhand information from travelers or from whatever we could glean from the news broadcasts and so forth.
And you developed an interest in Far Eastern studies, having studied postgraduate studies in Chinese studies.
I studied at University of Michigan, did some graduate work there, and at Columbia University, Chinese language studies and so forth. Continued with private tutoring in Chinese and Vietnam when I was working there, in Taiwan. At the end of all of that, I could say pen is in my uncle's garden and other useful expressions like that. But, I was not a great student. I did study the history and culture and so forth.
After graduation at undergraduate level, where you were an English major, you served in Korea. You were at that stage about, what, 23 years of age?
21, right after graduation from college.
And at the risk of you having to kill me if you confirm this, it's right, you served in the intelligence corps.
It was called the Counterintelligence Corps, and it was a very interesting year, handling clandestine agents and learning a great deal. And I didn't have to wear a uniform, and had my own vehicle, so I was out every night with my friends. It was actually, I would say, my best year of my life. I really enjoyed it. And then after that, I went back to an assignment at the Pentagon. But in between that, I had this chance you mentioned, I think earlier, to travel around Asia, courtesy of the U.S. Army. And it was my first encounter with Hong Kong, having traveled through Thailand, and India, and Singapore, and Japan. And when I got to Hong Kong, it was an oasis of civilization. And I just loved it, and I knew at that time I was going to end up spending a lot of my life here.
So you spent your time travelling after Korea, knew that Hong Kong was your ultimate destination, but first of all, you returned to the US in order to do your graduate studies, which also involved you teaching English in Vietnam?
I had this rather elevated title of Senior Linguistics Advisor to the Vietnamese Armed Forces Language School. Actually, I was just a warm body which the Army was able to engage through a contractor to go and help teach. We had a counterpart arrangement in Vietnam at the time between the U.S. Army and the Vietnamese Armed Forces. And so the idea was that we had to communicate, and my job was to help develop these language programs in Saigon.
Your family must have been amazed by this drift to the Far East. You were born in Ohio, in the US.
Akron, Ohio, yes.
Tell us a bit about your parents. Your father and your mother, were they active in Jewish life in the States?
Yeah, my father was really a very strong influence. After he served in World War II in Okinawa, where his job was guarding Japanese prisoners of war, he came back to the United States and immediately joined a temple in Akron called Temple Israel. And this is a temple that can be described as practicing classic Reform Judaism. We had a professional organist who was not Jewish, a professional choir who was not Jewish. The rabbi was Jewish and the cantor was Jewish. And my father was a tyrant of sorts. He made sure we all went to services for 10 or 12 years until I managed to get away to go off to university. We never missed a Friday night service. And he was a teacher at the Sunday school and later the principal. And this was very important to him, his Judaism, and I resented it when my conservative and Orthodox friends tended to treat Reform Judaism as less than authentic Judaism. It was very valid in my mind, and my father considered a very committed Jew. My brother was very much influenced by my dad as well. He was very active in the fight in support of the Soviet Jews, the refuseniks, intellectuals and artists who had not been allowed to leave the Soviet Union. He helped start the Judaic Studies program at the University of Cincinnati, where he was studying. He was gained some prominence as a speaker, debates at regional and national level on Jewish themes. So, yes, we came from, that kind of an atmosphere. When I came to Hong Kong, my father was always urging me, start a Reformed congregation because I would be complaining about the lack of a familiar type of worship service.
You were one of 4 children. You had 2 sisters and a brother.
Yeah.
And sadly, all 3 siblings had predeceased you.
My brother, the one I was just talking about, died at a very tragically young age of 21, of a brain tumor. And my sister died at the age of 39. I have one sister living in the United States.
And David, who died tragically young, he has actually, before his death, he had established a Judaic studies program.
Yeah, there's a scholarship award there that was established by my cousin. People compete every year for scholarships under the David Green Memorial Fund, or Scholarship Fund, based on their activities in the Jewish community.
So this was a household of, it sounds like, plenty lively Jewish debate. If none of you could miss Friday night dinner was a feature, and 4 children and 2 interested Jewish parents. Lots of debate, lots of discussion at a time of career and a whole change of the world going on at those times.
I don't think so. No, it was my dad calling the shots, and there wasn't too much discussion about whether or not you wanted to go to services or not. It was pretty straightforward.
You joined your father's business for a while after graduation. What did your father do?
My father was a real entrepreneur. He was involved in various businesses over his working career, and all of them quite successful. He was in the scrap business, which is fashionably called recycling today. He owned a mattress and furniture factory. He got into recycled paper also for a while. He was ahead of his time in a way. And so what's the rest of the question?
You joined him for a while after graduation. How did that go?
Yeah, well, as I say, he was a pretty strong character, so I was required to go to work. He'd grown up in the Depression, very tough times. His mother was a Russian revolutionary, escaped from the Tsar, and he managed to get an education. Nevertheless, he had a master's degree in psychology and so forth. But he made sure that the kids all worked, and from a reasonably young age. I don't think we were necessarily in violation of the labor laws at the time, but we were down there after school every day working, and during the summers and so forth. And I guess in retrospect that was very good. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get my own kids to have that kind of a discipline.
What sort of work were you doing with him at that time? Did you have any speciality?
Well, when I was helping him in the junkyard, this was pretty sophisticated work. It was putting a piece of metal in a vise and taking a hammer and knocking the metal until you got the most valuable part of the piece, which would be in most cases copper. And for that work, I later described myself in my resumes as a metals analyst. And yes, I did other jobs. During the summer, before I went into the military, I had a job driving an ice cream truck, and for that, purposes of the resume, I was a dispenser of frozen commodities. So yes, I did a lot of useful work as a kid.
It's becoming clear why you only lasted a year with your father, who moved on to Hollywood to do screenwriting, such creative descriptions. How did the move to Hollywood come about?
My best friend, Stan Sherman, I was rooming with him in New York while I was going to Columbia. And he took off for the West Coast, and he made it. He started writing scripts that were being accepted by Batman and a few films and so forth. So he urged me to come out and join him, and he had his beautiful house in Malibu on the beach, formerly belonging to a movie star. And I took a shot at it, but I just was no good. I just couldn't get interested in doing that. And after a few months, I left and took off. So I was never a screenwriter. It would have been very nice, I'm sure, but I didn't make it.
And you then made the move into journalism.
Yeah, as I say, I went to work for a paper in New Jersey, associated with the Bergen Record, and got some, say, basic training in how to be a journalist, and then was determined that I would use my Chinese studies background to apply that and try to get a job in the Far East when I came out.
So we were by now in the late 60s, about 1968,
Right.
and you're making that move into Hong Kong. Shortly after arriving here, it's right that you met your lovely wife, Grace. Grace had been born in Macau, and you met her here in Hong Kong?
Yeah, that's kind of a funny story because when I was in Taiwan working as a reporter, there was a guy by the name of Albert Yan who had been imprisoned in 1963, accused of being a Russian spy. He had written a story about the Taiwan Navy, which the government there didn't like, and he was sentenced to death through the intercession of, he was working for UPI, United Press International, and Agence France Presse, and through the intervention of, I think it went all the way up to President Kennedy at the time, the sentence was commuted to a prison term. She was serving in Green Island, and one of the stories I was working on had to do with political prisoners. And somehow it came to his knowledge, I don't know how. And then I came to Hong Kong and I went to a party and I met a young lady, and it happened to be Albert's daughter, Grace. Albert, incidentally, was released after 12 years in prison, and I went to retrieve him. And he was at that time, let's see, from 63 to 75. I guess he must have been around 60 or something like that. And later ended up in the United States and became a great supporter of President Clinton. But yeah, I ran into Grace. That's how I met. I didn't meet her because of that, but I think she was kind of surprised that I knew about her father even before we met.
At that time, Grace was working for Pan Am.
Pan Am, yeah.
So all part of past history. I hear that Grace was very helpful to you at a time when you were trying to make a decision as to whether or not to rent a place in Lugar Road.
Well, when I first came here, a friend of mine, Mary Gemmell, who was with Time-Life, had a party, and I went up to her place. It was on Lugar Road, that road that circles around the peak. And I just was so taken by it, and just so lovely. And I said, Mary, I said, if you ever leave, please let me know. And a few weeks later, she called me, she said, I'm leaving. So I immediately went up there, and I met the landlady who lived in the building right next to us. And then later I brought Grace up there to look at the place, and she was my girlfriend at the time, we weren't married yet. And I said, gee, I don't know if this is really a big step. I was living on Gloucester Road down in Wan Chai, and I said, you know, this is a big step. It's going to be paying about a third more in rent, which meant that I was going to be paying $600 a month instead of $400 a month. So it was a tough decision to make.
But she told you to have courage and go.
She said, go for it, yeah.
Wise woman, $600 Lugar Road.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, it was under, the government had rent controls that lasted up until about 15 or so years ago, so it never really went into, you know, a commercial level of rents, otherwise it would have never been able to afford it.
And although I'm not going to dwell on property prices too long, I understand you've got one of those horrific Hong Kong property stories that haunts everybody about whether they should have bought or shouldn't have
Well,
bought.
when the landlord or his agent offered to sell the building, it's a building with 6 units for $250,000, and I said no, I didn't have the money actually. $250,000 Hong Kong, yeah.
For 6 flats on Lugar Road, the Peak.
Right.
We have the man who said no, thank you very much. Can you imagine?
Well, yeah, obviously.
Everything with grace, even if you didn't make very good property decisions, life decisions were great. And you certainly chose the right woman. You married here, Grace converted, you had 2 sons, David and Jonathan, and you as a family settled down into life in Hong Kong. In 1978, you've been here for 10 years by then. Who were you working for at that stage?
Well, you know, my mentor for NBC, the guy who hired me, by a guy named Wells Hangan, who I thought was the most brilliant journalist I had ever met. Wells and our soundman Waku, cameraman Waku, and our soundman Roger Cole were killed in Cambodia. Actually, there were 17 journalists killed in the course of covering the war in Cambodia. And so Wells was my mentor or rabbi, was no longer there to support my career, and about that time, a manager of our Saigon bureau suggested that we start doing some business together with Vietnamese handicrafts, and we at that point started importing things here to Hong Kong and selling them to department stores and retailing them ourselves.
And the we is, you and Grace decided to do that?
Yeah.
And what sort of things were you bringing in and selling, and where were you trying to sell?
Department stores, and then we actually were hawkers for a while. We had a friend, a Chinese guy, who had a garden up on, what is the name of that road? Tin Hau Temple Road. And he said, look, I'll let you put your ceramic elephants there and for free. And that would presumably draw people to buy his product, which were plants. He was one of these rent-a-plant kind of operations. And I was putting all of these advertisements in the newspaper, so, you know, what's to be lost? And we were bringing in a lot of expatriates, especially on the weekends. We only did this on the weekends. And I don't think I've ever been healthier. We had fresh air and sunshine. Everybody thought we spent our weekends at the beach or at a resort or something like that. And Grace was with me, and I had another American guy as a manager to help me.
And this is schlapping. I'm sure everybody's got one at home. Anybody who's been here over 20 years must have. But these are a big ceramic elephant.
Good exercise, right?
With the flat base. I mean, and these you were schlapping all the way across the garden.
I tell you, it's better than joining a health club. It's a lot cheaper.
You decided to give this new company a very interesting name. Can you tell us what it was called?
Well, I mean, I was married to Grace. We were selling ceramic elephants. It was only natural that we would call it what we did, Amazing Grace Elephant Company.
And how did the name come about? Over a few drinks, or?
Journalists are known to have a few drinks, and I was sitting around with some of my colleagues at the time, and yes, that's how it came about.
And the business has gone from strength to strength, and all of us know Amazing Grace, and you continue to be working in the business. Well,
we grew the business to about 9 stores and a mail order catalog business in the United States, and then started to consolidate it to fewer stores. And about 5 years ago, almost 5 years ago, Watson's here in Hong Kong, in conjunction with one of the world's largest airport retailers called Nuance, the Nuance Group in Switzerland, approached us and gave us this opportunity to collaborate with them in opening airport stores, which we did in Hong Kong, in Terminal 1, Terminal 2, in Singapore, and Changi Airport. And then working still with Nuance to supply them at the Macau Venetian Resort Hotel. I have to point out that Chuck is a partner in this business too. My friend Chuck Monette sitting here in the front row. And supplying them in some of their other locations as well.
So life was settled. You've known Chuck for a while. You know many people in this room for a long time.
I'm surprised how few I know. There's so many people here that, oh my God, where'd they come from? I thought I was the oldest person in Hong Kong.
Your boys were growing up. You and the family were members of the Ohalea, which...
I came here in 1969, right? And I was used to the Reform style of worship, but Ohalea was the only option for me. So I went to services, although about the only thing I understood was when the rabbi would say, turn to page such and such in English. Nevertheless, I continued to go, and there was a guy there, and some of you may actually know him, by the name of Solomon Saul, who claimed to be a financial advisor to Lord Kaduri. And he would invite those few of us who came to services, and there weren't that many of us, up to his place for a Shabbat dinner afterwards. He had a cook who made delicious Jewish food. And that was a wonderful experience for me to share the table, and the food and the wine, and the companionship, and the conversation with other Jewish people. But that, unfortunately, was one of the few efforts that I could see that was made in the community to reach out or accommodate or befriend or welcome a newcomer, get on a Reformed Jew. Later, years later, I learned that Lord Kaduri had brought a Reform rabbi, a very prominent Reform rabbi, who had a congregation in St. Louis for many years, by the name of Ferdinand Isserman, who spent a term here in 1963 to 1965. And reading a short history of the community by Lord Kaduri, he described him as a man of strong character who succeeded in unifying the community. That was a surprise to me. And in 1975, when David was born, September of 1975, and I approached the rabbi, at that time I think it was Rabbi Ben Hayan, I can recall. And I asked him if he would do the bris for my son. And he said, well, your wife as a Reformed convert is not Jewish. You, as a Reformed Jew, are not Jewish. And then certainly your son is not Jewish. And there were other incidents. Judy Ellman, who was the son of a daughter of a Reformed rabbi, wrote a letter that Chuck showed me years later, saying that I left the Jewish community when the Jewish community left me. That is when I wanted to borrow a chuppah from the rabbi for my wedding at Hong Kong, at the Hong Kong Club, and he refused. So maybe these were just the only two incidents that ever occurred, or maybe there was more and they're just not being talked about.
That being said, the Ohalea was still, at that stage, the center of Jewish life in Hong Kong. You were going regularly to shul. By this time, 31st of May, 20 years ago in 1988, you as a family would regularly be going on Shabbat to Ohalea. And David, at that time, was practicing for his bar mitzvah.
Yeah.
But whatever feelings of dissatisfaction there might have been as to whether or not it was the ideal place, it was still the place that was your spiritual home. So tell us what happened literally 20 years ago to the day, 31st of May 1988, that suddenly changed things for you. You were 4 months away from David's bar mitzvah.
Yeah.
What happened on that day?
It was a Sunday. You recall these events very clearly, things which affect your life in a rather serious way. It was a Sunday morning, and David had been having his private bar mitzvah lesson with Rabbi Meyer Ben Susan in Rabbi's study at the synagogue on the first floor. And as you pointed out, he had been having his bar mitzvah lessons for several months, for 8 months. Bar mitzvah was due to come about a few months later. And David had been in the Sunday school all these years, as well as my other son, Jonathan. And Rabbi Ben Susan called me and says, can you please come down to talk to you? And it's urgent. So I did, and told me, look, I'm sorry, I won't be be able to do the bar mitzvah for your son because your wife is not Jewish. Well, this could hardly have been a surprise to him. And, just in preparing for this talk, looking back over the history of what's happening in Hong Kong around that time, it's the most remarkable coincidence because the community was in some turmoil over the issue of the trustees' intention to redevelop the property, and in the course of that, demolish the synagogue. Considerable opposition had risen from religious grounds and the grounds of trying to preserve it as a historic site and so forth. And on May 17th of 1988, a ruling came from the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, the Lord Emanuel Jacobowitz, sanctioning the demolition on the condition that the strict Orthodox practices would be preserved of Ol Hel-Leah. In the meantime, until a replica could be built, and the traditional character of the synagogue was maintained. That was May 17th of 1988, and May 29th, Rabbi Ben Susan calls me down. What a remarkable coincidence. And yet, that was the story, and that's what we had to live with.
And what impact did this immediately have on you, or what impact did you think it might have on generally?
Well, at first I thought about that and weighed what could be done. I considered maybe the only course is to go back to the United States, take my son, and have the bar mitzvah there. A couple of days later, though, I met up with Chuck, I just mentioned, at the American Club, and I told him what the rabbi told me. And Chuck is a very mild-mannered guy, and I'd never seen him so enraged. I never saw Chuck swearing before and cursing. And it was Chuck's sense of right and wrong, actually, I think, that inspired this determination that this kind of thing would never happen again to a Jewish boy or girl in Hong Kong. And from that point on, a week later, I went to the annual general meeting, June 7th, 8th, or 9th, something like that, of 1988, of the Ol Hel-Leah Synagogue and Jewish Club. And I made my case, I made my appeal. I quote you from something I said to them at the time, that Grace was converted in Temple Emmanuel, Honolulu, Hawaii, by Rabbi J. Nodell on April 26, 1974, after following a course of study. She was warmly welcomed into the faith by the community there and is proud to be a Jew. As a good Jewish mother, she's been a guiding force in the religious education of David and his brother Jonathan. And with the help of their religious teachers, who I'm happy to say regard them highly, Grace and I have tried hard to give our sons Jewish identity and instill the values of Judaism. And there was a great sympathy for that. It was not a religious issue to the people attending. It wasn't you're Reformed or Orthodox or anything like that. There was really a sense of support. It surprised me, and it encouraged us to think, well, maybe we should carry it on.
What kind of impact do you think this would have had on David if at this stage you'd have...
just a little bit before I get to that answer, with Chuck's, support, I wrote a letter then to the general community and making the same case. And again, a pretty positive response. And a few days after that letter went out, it was June 17th, I got a phone call from Lord Kaduri. And he said, I agree totally. He says he himself can't understand anything of the services, and that he stays home and reads the services alone in English. So his suggestion to me was, kind of paraphrasing, he basically says, back off for 3 or 4 years until the new redeveloped Jewish club is built, and we'll try to provide some facilities for you there. And in the meantime, keep this confidential. Well, I didn't want to wait 3 or 4 years, and so we had a meeting, and the trustees suggested that they bring in 2 other rabbis, Orthodox rabbis, and together with Rabbi Ben Susan, there would be a Brit Milah and a ritual mikvah conversion, and then David would be able to have his bar mitzvah as an Orthodox Jew. And I thought, and Grace and I agreed, that this would basically deny our identity as Reformed Jews, and it would deny the authenticity of Reformed Judaism. And so alternatively, then the trustees agreed to bring in a Reform rabbi. So a week or so later, the senior rabbi of Temple Beth Israel in Melbourne, a 3,000 strong congregation, very distinguished and wonderful man, got a fax from under the letterhead of Amazing Grace Elephant Company asking if he could come to Hong Kong and do a bar mitzvah. And a few days later, John replied that of course he would. He said, have Torah well traveled. and John said something which really captured, I think, exactly what the issue was, and the answer to the question you just said. He said, it's strange how bad things can have good consequences, or not so strange that bigotry will trip itself up. The main person is, of course, David, and his sense of total acceptance and self-worth as a Jew, and as a person who would never be rejected. I am just simply offended by all this that has happened. Angry is a better word. And that's what the issue was, and I think that's what really hurt all of us so much.
And that's why it was so important for you that the bar mitzvah should be here in Hong Kong, the place of David's birth. He was a child of mixed race. Hong Kong had always been his home.
Exactly. What is his
spiritual
identity?
home was of LA. It had to be Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And his bar mitzvah did take place here at the American Club.
And the trustees came.
And so always, and this is the trustees of the Incorporated Jewish Community of Hong Kong, as it was then.
As they had changed then.
It subsequently changed, but as it was then. And at that time, the trustees were fully supportive and doing all they could to assist you with this.
The trustees were locked in by the ruling from Lord Jacobus. As it turned out, they didn't tear down the synagogue, but at the same time as trustees individually on various occasions said to Chuck, to myself, to others, that they felt that they were locked in. They couldn't change once they had asked for the decision, and that was it. And not that they weren't supportive, but they were not. Ben Frankel, who worked with us on the committee later, the UJC, put it quite well. He said it's the ideologues who beat the war drums most loudly. And so it was, I think, a minority of people who resisted our participation and our being able to benefit from the trust. The trustees themselves, I think, were very supportive. They were us.
So, driven by Chuck's passion, which is a sight few of us have been fortunate enough to witness. So, fortified by that passion, then perhaps you and Chuck got moving in terms of the creation of the UJC. In those early days, tell me what you were doing. How were you getting people along to services? How were you finding locations for services?
Well, since the club was ruled off limits to us in the synagogue, we were having services in people's homes all around Hong Kong. In my home, we had this big flat. Actually, in addition to the place up on the peak, which I just couldn't let go, we had rented a larger apartment on Robinson Road. People's homes, just about every club that I can think of, we had services. We would combine them with dinners, and the response was just amazing. And we continued to grow until looked like there was a good reason to, organize ourselves as a congregation.
Did you manage to get a good turnout for, say, the high holidays?
Well, I mentioned John Levi, the other extraordinary rabbi that was able to help us was Sam Joseph, who was, I think, perhaps the most prominent Jewish educator in Reform Judaism in the United States. And he came out, and that 1989, September, together with Jerry Schneider, who used to be the cantor, for Ohel Leah Synagogue, but was denied that role because he had a pitch pipe, which Ohel Leah would not let him use. So we persuaded him to be our cantor, and together with Sam, they conducted the service. Carol Benson, and nobody gets by Carol at the door. She was signing everybody in. She made her report after the high holidays. We had 200 people for Rosh Hashanah, 300 for Kol Nidre. A few days before that, I had a call from Lord Kaduri's secretary to please reserve 5 seats for him and his family. He was the first to arrive. Chuck escorted him to his seat. And a few days later, October 2nd, we got a check from him, not from him personally, but on behalf of the trustees, for $5,000. And that was, I think, really a wonderful endorsement.
And the location of the high holidays that year was at the China Fleet Club?
It was China Fleet Club, and Janet Golden, in the true Jewish tradition of making sure nobody ever goes hungry, was in charge of a little after, a snack after the Rosh Hashanah service. And she over-ordered a huge amount. And it happened that the 7th Fleet was in town using the China Fleet Club. And we supplied half the China, the 7th Fleet with tuna fish sandwiches and egg salad sandwiches. and great time.
The UJC was formally incorporated a couple of years later, so the UJC is coming up for its own Chai year, which will all be very exciting, and there'll be celebrations. But tell me, how involved did you become in the administration and the organisation of the UJC?
Well,
how full-time a job did that become?
Essentially for those next almost 10 years, it became a full-time job. Fortunately, Grace was able to take up the slack in the business, to her distress at times, quite a bit of distress. I took a lot of flack, but I was convinced, and I think Grace will agree today, that this was a worthy sacrifice that she made for this cause. And nobody wanted to be chairman, so I was the chairman. And I think you understand that. Not to say you're not a great chairman,
but it's
or
never
to reflect on myself.
Absolutely, it's never a fight to the death to find a chairman, is it?
And so I did that, and having been a journalist, I started turning out a newsletter, and in the absence of brick and mortar, we created an illusion of substance through a blizzard of newsletters and flyers and letters to the community, to the trustees. They got sick of us. Michael Green came up to me once and said, "Stop preaching to me." All of our talk about trust owes this to us. This is what the Jacob Sassoon said. And Lord Kaduri had said that to me in that phone call too. He said the trust simply says that it's for the Jewish community of Hong Kong and nothing else. And so we didn't try to distinguish that this is only for Orthodox. Michael Green, I remember saying to a group of us that they considered Jacob Sassoon a far-sighted, was the original settler, a far-sighted man. The trustees, all of them, said that to us on various occasions. This was the Lord Kaduri's vision. This was their idea as well.
we've got a selection of the shofars here, which is the publication of the UJC, which is still going. These publications were done entirely by you. It's scary to sort of read back the history of Hong Kong over the last 20-odd years. But you were not just chairman, but producer of the magazine as well, and the newsletter.
It was a labor of love. Mill Baserman might have been the only person who ever read them. I don't know, because he would send me nasty letters sometimes, and sometimes nice letters. But I'll tell you how I found out that people actually read them. If you misspelled their name. Wow. There's a huge readership out there. Everybody's reading every word.
How unusual. So many Jewish people would complain and have a view about it.
Right, exactly.
You've moved on to even more interesting topics. You've left the UJC in safe and secure hands and growing from strength to strength. And you're now involved in another major project, the China Schools Foundation. Tell us something about this new project that you're involved in.
I was inspired by what Barbara Thomas was doing with the UJC and raising funds for scholarships and building schools in China. And it so happened that my business was doing okay, and my staff were doing a job much better than I could anyhow. And I came across this thing about what Confucius had said that at the age of 70, you can follow your heart's desires and not worry about stepping over the line. So I was pretty close to 70 at that time, and I had been supporting some Chinese kids, and I needed some soul-redeeming work at this point. You were handling the UJC so well, and I couldn't do the UJC anymore because after all those years of going to committee meetings and so forth, it was like Groundhog Day, you know, and you would wake up and the same day over and over again. The committee meetings were the same over and over again. And so, as coincidentally, a friend of mine, one of the former committee members, Ben Frankel, was free from his work that he had been doing as an educator. He had started what some people consider the best primary school in Hong Kong called the Academy. So Ben was interested in working together with me, Barbara. We made trips to China, and we've raised funds. We've found a lot of interest, and we're very optimistic about the future for that.
And do you feel that that project in any way enhances your own Jewish spiritual journey or beliefs? Is that an important part for you of your own spiritual development?
I never thought about it. I just thought, hey, you got to do something that's useful, and I'm not a beach person. I'm not. I can't imagine myself not working, and here we are on the edge of China. My wife is Chinese. My kids are half Chinese. Despite all the talk about China having X trillion of dollars in reserves, the fact is the money doesn't get from the central government to the rural schools. It's a deplorable situation in some of the provinces, and it's just work that is potentially very satisfying.
You've made a huge contribution to Jewish life in Hong Kong. You've only lived here 40 years, you're only 70. Have you thought about where you might be going to next and what the next project might be? Can you imagine not living in Hong Kong?
You know, one of the great things about having a Chinese wife with kids who are partially Chinese is that those values, I think, are instilled in them. My son is a very successful hedge fund manager in New York, and the idea is you support your parents. I think that's the Chinese idea. Quite unlike maybe in my high school yearbook, and everybody was talking about their ambitions, I wrote my ambition was to retire early and live off my old man. But in this case, I'm kind of depending on my son to look after my wife and myself, but not really, no.
But you can imagine your future remaining here in Hong Kong.
We'll stay here. I don't know how Grace feels, but she feels very much, she feels very happy here because she has a very successful career in her own right in insurance. And in fact, she has some forms with her if anybody. And she'll give you a card, and so she loves being Chinese in Hong Kong. Yeah.
Bob, the contribution you made is significant beyond belief to Hong Kong, and thank you very much indeed for sharing that story with us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Bob Breen. Before I let you escape, there might well be one or two questions from people here. You have a lot of friends, and I know everybody's going to want to down to the barbecue. Would anybody like to ask any questions or make any comments?
I'd like to.
Yes, Paulette.
This is Mrs. Melvin Baserman speaking here. I'd like to thank Bob because we came to Hong Kong 16 years ago, this past April. I'm very emotional. It was a very wonderful speech. And I wasn't a practicing Jew before I came to Hong Kong. Just, okay, love, you know. But when we came here and our son was 4, we decided to belong to something, and I think my husband called up, he tracked you down. And I'll never forget, Bob came to our house.
We were desperate for members.
And he picked up my husband because I thought this was crazy. We just moved to Hong Kong and some guy's going to drag us to some kind of no synagogue, I don't know what.
Yeah.
And
took him out to Repulse Bay.
Exactly. And kidnapping, I didn't know what it was going to be. And that was the start of something really beautiful. The days of the American Club and Italian food for Shabbat dinner, and our son falling asleep on the table, and everything which is added to the life that we have in Hong Kong, and the pouring out of goodwill from everybody here, from my son's bar mitzvah to my husband's recent illness, to everything we've celebrated, I have to say it came from you. So thank you.
Those Shabbat dinners at the American Club were a very key element of our success. And that was based on that famous Jewish dictum, feed them and they will come. And it was just a wonderful venue on the 49th floor of the American Club overlooking the harbor. It was a wonderful Italian buffet. And this was the legacy of Solomon Saul, actually. It was Solomon Saul. You know, who had moved me so much with those wonderful dinners at his home that I felt this is what I want to do. And when the opportunities came up for us, as I say, we had this large flat on Robinson Road. It was a triplex, 3 levels, and we had the opportunity to do services at my place, especially Shabbat Shabbat. And it was filled, people on the balcony overlooking the living room and sitting on the steps, and all the living room filled, and Rabbi Sam Joseph, and at that time we had a cantor coming out, Susan Frankel, and it was just a wonderful experience. I mean, you know, home services, it's a great idea.
Ladies and gentlemen, any more questions? Mr. Bob Breen.
We'll let you know when the next one is. Thanks to Sharon. Thanks to Bob. We're very pleased as the Jewish Historical Society to be able to be a bridge between communities that sometimes seem to need a bridge between them. And Bob, looking around tonight, you'll see that not only are you not the oldest person in Hong Kong, you're not even the oldest Jew in Hong Kong, or the oldest Jewish Guilo in Hong Kong. So, ladies and gentlemen, Sharon and Bob, and we'll be in touch for the next one.